So I decided to do my spin-off topic on sports specialization and in youth sports, but focusing mainly on injury. My name is Bryon Harper, for those who don't know me, which I think everybody does. So just a brief introduction of sports specialization. What's up, Jake? Good time. I just started. Said I'd wait till 10 after for you, and then I went. So you just cut it. But anyway, a brief introduction. So it's defined as intense year-round training in a single sport with the exclusion of other sports. The concept of sports specialization, it started from the 10,000 hour rule, which originated from music. Erickson said that to master anything, you need 10,000 hours of experience in it. So he was mainly talking about music. Job is what it related to, but then people started thinking for sport. So now if I do this sport for 10,000 hours, that's where I can start to perfect it and become elite level. I guess I'll stop there. But specialization in sport evolved from the privatization of sport and changes in parenting, and there is limited scientific research that it is actually effective. So once people started seeing that you could get a scholarship and you can go get college paid for, you can start becoming successful in sports, there's been a lot of push from parents to their kids on becoming better, participating harder, becoming, more involved in one sport. So about 40 million youth play sports in the United States annually, and about 70% of those drop out by the time that they are 13. That's about 3 out of every 4 people will stop playing sports by the time they hit high school. Basically, starting off, when we are starting sports, whether the age anywhere from 4 to 8 is typically when people start to participate in sports, but we are starting just with functional movement skills, basic motor skills, getting someone familiar with how their body moves and going through that. So that can be done by playing one sport, that can be done by just playing around. You don't have to specialize in that per se. That can be done by just growing up in general. Then once we start getting a little bit older, maybe a little bit more competitive, we get into power, speed, and agility skills. Again, that could come from a multitude of different areas, whether we're playing different sports or whether we're training, maybe might begin now. And this is where you see a lot of people may start to specialize. But the best time to specialize is once we have gained the power, speed, and agility and our functional movement, and then we start going into our sport-specific skills and kind of diving into that single sport. So, here are just some potential benefits. Oh, that's very blurry. But potential benefits of sports specialization is you potentially get better coaching and skill from, you think if you are in a club sport or if you're in AAU or just one sport, there's probably a chance that it's not just somebody's dad or mom that's just coaching. You might have someone that's actually played the sport professionally or played in at least at a collegiate level, that's had a lot of experience in it. So if someone's playing a sport year-round, you would assume that they might get increased skill in that sport because that's what they're doing year-round. They're training for that single sport. Improved time management. They're not jumping around from sport to sport, so they get on a set routine and they can kind of get used to that. And then, enjoyment of sport and talent development. If someone sees that they're starting to become very successful and outgrowing their peers and becoming more successful than them, most people get joy out of that, becoming successful. Some of the risks, we'll go over more of those, but costs. So joining these clubs and being in a sport year-round can be quite expensive. There's a lot of competition on who can get into those, so money is definitely a big part of it. Increased injury risk, we'll talk about certain types of injuries and what would be increased for that. You can see time demands, burnout and motivation loss. I'm not going to talk very much about burnout. That's another topic that kind of offsets sports specialization, but I didn't talk too much about that. And then increased stress and pressure. With being in that single sport, you're expected to produce a lot more than somebody that's only in that sport for 2 or 3 months out of the year. So here's a little bit more detail, but the biggest thing for this that I want to take away is increased injury, whether it's overuse or poor coaching. If someone's not tuned in, they start specializing in when they're more in the functional movement skills and they haven't really gained their power, speed, and agility and start going right into sport-specific skills. We might see an increase of injury with that as well, because they don't have the proper musculature or the proper technique to perform those skills. Those other ones talk about burnout, and again, I'm not really going to talk too much about that. So there is some scientific evidence that early sports specialization is a risk factor for injury. There was a case control study of about 1,200 people from 7 to 18-year-olds, and they demonstrated that over the course of 3 years, picking a main sport to focus on was an independent risk factor for injury, even after adjustment for age and hours per week in total sports. So we can see our risk of injury comes from the volume of work, our sports specialization, or what sport we're doing, and then our age and what maturity level our body's at. Here are just some high risk and low risk areas for possible fractures in adolescents, depending on which sport. So a lot of the tension side of the femoral neck, that was, we saw that a lot in people specializing in ice hockey, especially goalies. Lumbar and spine, we saw most of those cases in gymnastics because they were doing a lot of loading and bearing with that. But stress fractures are likely the most common youth overuse injury and are often overlooked as growing pains. Bone bruises and normal wear and tear. The risk factors for stress fractures are the same for adult and pediatric populations. And then overuse and decreased caloric intake and overtraining are the most common causes. So we see overuse, overtraining kind of go hand in hand. We see that a lot within sports specialization. So this is just a case study that I made up, but this is on a 10-year-old baseball pitcher who specialized when they say the average person that specializes in baseball is about 8 or 9 years old. 9 years old is the first time that you can start Little League. So he follows the pitch count for the games, which that came about in 2006 is when they started looking at pitch count and holding people back. He doesn't take the necessary breaks to properly heal. He takes a week off after he pitched 85 to 100 pitches, but he doesn't take the 2 or 3 months off in the fall or the winter to recuperate. So there was a study that found that some young pitchers in the Little League World Series in 2016 were throwing as many pitches in 3 to 4 innings as Major League pitchers were throwing in 8 to 9 innings. So that's a big concern where people started saying, holy cow, maybe we should even reduce this pitch count more than what we have right now. So, what injuries may be present? Youth pitchers tend to depend on rotator musculature and trunk rotation in combination with humeral torque. So you can see he's torquing pretty good with that, but he's a little bit more lax in his joints because his bones haven't fused together yet. His musculature isn't quite as developed. But they have open epiphyseal plates, and that is where we get little league arm, or that's where the growth plate kind of separates and stunts the growth of the humerus, and that comes from overuse and repeated measures from those. So rotator cuff tendonitis, shoulder instability, and then little leaguer's elbow are the three main things, as well as Tommy John surgery. Tommy John surgery used to be a surgery that was pretty much only seen in major league pitchers, adults that were pitching for years and years, and now they tore their ulnar collateral ligament. But now, in 2017, there was a study that 53% of Tommy John surgery are now done on teenagers, and that's a crazy statistic if we're looking at even 10 years ago what it used to be to now, and how many kids are now getting surgery. I know we talked about this when we talked about sports specialization, that some people think that getting Tommy John surgery younger will actually increase your performance and throw a couple miles per hour faster. You can get extra curve on your ball. But the reason I picked baseball in particular is because this is kind of a big focus point when it comes to sports specialization. There are over 100 minor league teams within just the United States. That's not even counting when we go down into Central and South America. There's a lot of minor league teams down there that people play for. But this is a chance that an athlete has probably the highest of obtaining an elite level, because there's so much baseball going on. They could have a higher chance of that. So here's a quote from Tommy John, the pitcher who obviously had ulnar collateral ligament surgery, and now it's named after him. But he said, "I could give 30 lessons a week at $100 a lesson during the winter just to 8 and 12-year-olds, but I refuse to do it. Those kids do not need to be playing baseball year-round. What they do not understand and what their parents don't understand and will never understand, that it makes no difference whether you start at 8 or 18. I can take a kid who has never pitched in his life until he is 17. By the time he is 19, he will throw as well or as better as the kid who has been pitching since he was 8, and with less wear and tear on his arm." So, I don't know, I thought that was a pretty interesting quote, that if you could start someone a decade later, I don't know how true if he could actually get someone in 2 years to pitch somebody that's been pitching for 10, 11 years already. But the wear and tear, with less wear and tear on his arm, is what really caught me, that if someone's doing those, they already have those motor skills, they have those speed and strength and agility skills, and now we start focusing in when they're 16, 17 years old and start getting into sport-specific skills, their body's going to become, they're going to adapt easier and be better. So the next case study is gymnastics. The structured competition for Olympics starts in age 4, but they don't actually become competitive until age 7. So gymnastics is a specialization that people see quite often, because gymnastics is linked with success at a younger age and when the body's not fully developed. So unlike athletes in other sports, gymnasts are always learning new skills and increasing difficulty that put a lot of loads on the body. Granted, these people are a little bit smaller typically, or a little bit lighter than people that are starting and growing up, that are already adults while they're starting, but the demands and the flexibility that they have to have put a lot of strain onto their joints. We see a lot of several overuse injuries in gymnasts, and varies from athlete to athlete. So commonly reported overuse injuries are to the wrist and low back in female gymnasts, and to the shoulder and elbow in male gymnasts. The differences in injury patterns are related to the differences in equipment used and key maneuvers that differ their emphasis and flexibility versus strength. So typically females are a little bit more flexible, whereas men are a little bit more strong, typically. So some treatment options for this, pretty basic, but rest, physical therapy, strengthening. We might see a lot of muscular imbalances with this, so correcting muscular imbalances is a big thing with sports. Cross training is the biggest thing in research that they say for if someone is going to specialize, by giving them a break of a couple months during the year and cross train. Take your body, if someone's a baseball thrower or a pitcher, have them take a couple months off, do something that they're not using their arms at all, maybe play soccer or something of that nature. And then surgery at the very end. That is the last option. So here's some values of early sport diversification. There has been no study saying that sports specialization will increase your chances of becoming an elite athlete. But the thought of diversification is you are more of a well-rounded athlete if you diversify instead of specialize. So I just have a couple-minute video, about a 4-minute video. This guy's a little odd, but he explains things pretty well.
Potentially bad for the young kids. And so in today's Ask Dr. Geyer video, we're going to discuss some of the possible risks with early single sport specialization. Jack in Newark, Illinois asks, what are the injuries that you see most due to specializing in a sport too early? Well, I think it's really important to know that some of these single sport specializations, doing the same sports year-round, can lead to risks. Now, generally, yes, traumatic injuries, broken bones and things like that, that can occur even in a single sport played year-round, if you played football year-round. But this video doesn't really talk about this. Here, what we're talking about are overuse injuries. The problem with playing a single sport year-round is that basically you're doing the same motion all the time. You could be pitching, where you're basically, as a youth pitcher, throwing pitches all year round. Throwing any one pitch doesn't cause a problem, but those microscopic stresses build up over weeks and months and years. And if you don't give your body enough time to rest, that can eventually become an overuse injury. The advantage of switching sports is you're still getting exercise, you're still learning sports strategies and athletic skills, but you're focusing on a different sport that has different stresses. It stresses different parts of the body, so it gives your primary part, let's just say baseball pitching, gives your shoulder and elbow time to rest, and maybe if it's a sport like soccer, now all that stress is going to your foot and your ankle and your knee. So you're getting exercise, but it's limiting the stress on the body. Now, the type of injuries really depend on the sport, the type of activity, and where that stress goes. In young kids, a lot of times their bones haven't finished growing. Their growth plates are still open, and so the bones are the weakest link, and their tendons and ligaments are actually stronger. Adults, it's kind of the reverse, where our bones are the strongest parts, and so we tend to get tendon and ligament injuries. So our overuse injuries in adults are going to be tendinitis of whatever part of the body that is. That's often what it is. Whereas in kids, very frequently, it's more bony injuries. It can be stress reactions and stress fractures. Up in the shoulder, you can have what we call little leaguer's shoulder, where you get a widening of the growth plate up at the shoulder. You can get irritation, inflammation of the growth centers of the bones around the elbow. Those are really common youth pitching injuries. And the same thing can happen in the leg, in the knee, in the foot of young athletes. Now, you can get tendon and ligament injuries in kids as well. Tommy John injuries are largely overuse injuries of the elbow. Not typically your 7 and 8-year-old kids, but now that used to be an injury just of pro pitchers. Now it's the most common age group for that surgery is actually high school kids. It's a really worrisome trend and completely preventable. So I am a big believer in basically not specializing in different sports. One, I think there's a lot of good things that come from playing different sports. You learn different skills, you learn balance and coordination that you might not get in one sport, you learn different aspects of teamwork. There's so many different benefits. I talked to Brandy Chastain, who was on the U.S. Women's National Team 1999 that won the Women's World Cup, and she told me that almost everybody on her team, she thinks maybe everybody on her team played different sports growing up, but you just don't see that anymore. But her argument is it teaches so many skills that you would never get just playing a single sport. But not just in terms of athletic performance, I really do believe that it can also decrease injuries, and there's numerous studies now that show that. So if you're a parent think through that. Maybe if they really like a particular sport, maybe they do that 2 seasons or maybe even 3, but give them either a season off, 2-3 months off where they don't play a sport, or they play something else and let that part of the body rest. I think that.
Okay. So that guy had a bit off, but he has pretty good information. That is all I have. My references there and there. Does anybody have any questions? No? Cool. I know we talked about this for,